The laughter erupted like thunder across the classroom when Mrs. Henderson called my name for the first time. Adichie? She stumbled, butchering every syllable of Adiz like it was some foreign curse word. 28 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, and I felt my cheeks burn with the kind of shame that makes you want to disappear into the floor. The sound of their amusement echoed off the walls, bouncing around in my chest like broken glass, cutting deeper with each reverberation. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Adiz Okafor, and at 17 I thought I had life figured out. We had moved from Nigeria to suburban Denver when I was 12, and by my senior year at Westfield High School, I believed I had successfully navigated the complex waters of being an African immigrant in America. I spoke without an accent, dressed like my peers in carefully chosen outfits from Target and Forever 21, and had even managed to make a few close friends who saw past my differences, or so I thought. The transition hadn't been easy. I still remembered those first few months in Denver, when everything felt foreign and overwhelming. The weather was different, crisp mountain air instead of Lagos humidity. The food was different, processed and packaged instead of the fresh, vibrant flavors of home. Even the light felt different, filtering through thin air at high altitude instead of the warm, golden glow I had grown up with. But by my senior year I had adapted. I knew which brands were cool and which weren't. I understood American slang and pop culture references. I could navigate the unspoken social hierarchies of high school with the same skill that had once helped me bargain in Lagos markets. I thought I had earned my place. My parents, Dr. Emmanuel Okafor and Dr. Grace Okafor, were both physicians who had worked tirelessly to rebuild their careers in America. They had sacrificed everything: prestigious positions in Lagos where they were respected department heads, proximity to extended family who had helped raise us, and the comfort of home where they understood every cultural nuance. The journey to get their medical licenses recognized in the United States had taken 3 years of studying, testing, and proving themselves all over again to people who treated their decades of experience as if it were worthless. I watched my father, who had been the head of cardiology at Lagos University Teaching Hospital, work as a medical assistant while studying for his licensing exams. I saw my mother, who had delivered hundreds of babies and saved countless lives, clean houses to pay for exam fees and continuing education credits. They never complained, never showed their frustration in front of my younger brother Chika and me, but I could see it in the way their shoulders sagged when they thought we weren't looking. By 2019, we lived in a beautiful house in Highlands Ranch, a predominantly white neighborhood where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets and every mailbox looked like it belonged in a magazine. We drove reliable cars, a Honda Pilot for my mother and a Toyota Camry for my father. The American dream, achieved through sheer determination and sacrifice. I was on track to attend Columbia University on a full academic scholarship, carrying a 4.8 GPA and perfect SAT scores that had made my guidance counselor's eyes light up with pride. I thought I had made it. I thought I belonged. I thought the hardest part of our journey was behind us. But that Tuesday morning in September changed everything I believed about my place in this country I had grown to call home. It reminded me that no matter how perfectly I performed Americanness, no matter how completely I assimilated, there would always be moments when I would be reduced to other by people who had never had to prove their right to belong. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, in AP Literature, about to study the great works of American and world literature, and the first lesson I learned was that my own name, my own identity, was somehow less valid than the characters we would read about in books. It started innocently enough. Mrs. Henderson, our new AP Literature teacher, was taking attendance on her first day. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested she had been teaching for decades. She had smoothly pronounced names like Catherine Williams, Michael Johnson, and Sarah Peterson, names that rolled off her tongue with the ease of familiarity. Then she reached my name on her roster and the entire atmosphere shifted. I watched her face change as she encountered something unfamiliar, something that didn't fit the pattern she expected. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly and she paused, staring at the paper as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something more manageable. Adichie Okafor? She attempted, her voice rising uncertainly on each syllable, turning my name into a question rather than a statement. The sound of my butchered name hung in the air like smoke. I felt every eye in the classroom turn toward me, and suddenly I was hyper-aware of everything. The way my traditional gold earrings caught the fluorescent light, the way my carefully straightened hair fell over my shoulders, the way my dark skin contrasted with the sea of pale faces around me. It's Adeze Okafor, I corrected gently, my voice barely above a whisper. Each syllable felt precious as it left my mouth, like I was sharing something sacred that was being trampled. I had done this countless times before, with substitute teachers, with new coaches, with administrators, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because this was AP Literature, a class I had been excited about, taught by a teacher I had heard great things about. Maybe it was because I was a senior now, and I had thought those days of mispronunciation and explanation were behind me. Well, that's quite a mouthful, Mrs. Henderson said with a nervous laugh, as if my name was somehow an inconvenience to her rather than a fundamental part of who I was. Do you have a nickname? Something easier? The word easier hit me like a slap. Easier for whom? Easier than what? My name wasn't difficult. It was just different from what she was used to. But in that moment, I felt the familiar weight of being asked to make myself smaller, to accommodate other people's comfort at the expense of my own identity. The classroom erupted in snickers. Brittany Morrison, who sat 2 rows behind me and had been in my honors classes since sophomore year, stage whispered to her friend, "Sounds like a sneeze." More laughter rippled through the room. Someone else chimed in, or like she's speaking in tongues. Each comment felt like a small betrayal. These weren't strangers making fun of me. These were people I had sat with in study groups, people I had shared labs with in chemistry, people I had cheered alongside at football games. We had a history together, or so I thought. But it was Jake Martinez who delivered the killing blow. "Why don't we just call you African Princess?" Seems fitting. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, dripping with mock reverence that made my title sound like an insult. The way he said, "African," made it sound like something distasteful he was spitting out, something foreign and unwelcome in this American classroom. My stomach dropped to my shoes. Jake had been my lab partner in AP Chemistry last year. We had spent hours working on projects together, and I had even helped him study for the midterm when he was struggling. I thought we had developed a mutual respect, if not friendship. But here he was, reducing me to a stereotype, making my heritage sound like something to be mocked rather than celebrated. The worst part was that some students were laughing, but others were just sitting there silently, letting it happen. Their silence felt almost worse than the act of mockery because it meant they saw nothing wrong with what was happening. They were comfortable with my humiliation, comfortable with watching me be diminished in front of them. "Actually," I said, my voice stronger now but still shaking slightly, "I'd prefer if you used my real name. It means something important." I could hear the desperation in my own voice, the plea for basic respect and dignity. But Mrs. Henderson waved her hand dismissively, as if my request was unreasonable, as if my insistence on my own name was somehow disruptive to her classroom management. "Let's just move on, shall we? Maybe you could pick an American name to make things simpler." An American name. The phrase echoed in my head like a mantra of exclusion. As if the name my grandmother had whispered into my ear when I was born, blessing me with the strength of generations of women before me, was somehow inferior to Katie or Ashley. As if the name that connected me to 5 generations of strong Igbo women, women who had survived colonialism and war and displacement, was somehow less valid than names that traced their origins back to European immigrants who had been welcomed with open arms. As if my identity needed to be simpler, to fit into American spaces, rather than American spaces needing to expand to include the beautiful complexity of who I was. I spent the rest of that class period feeling invisible and hypervisible all at once. Every time someone turned to look at me, I wondered if they were thinking about my weird name, mentally practicing their own version of how to mispronounce it. Every time someone whispered, I assumed they were making up new jokes about African princesses or foreign languages. When Mrs. Henderson called on other students, their names flowed easily from her lips, while mine remained unspoken, as if I had become nameless. By the time the bell rang, releasing us into the hallway chaos of passing period, I had made a decision that would haunt me for months to come. It felt like giving up a piece of myself, but it also felt like survival. I started going by Ada. The change was immediate and jarring. When I told my next teacher, "Just call me Ada," the relief on her face was obvious. No stumbling, no questions, no nervous laughter. Just simple acceptance of a name that fit comfortably in American mouths. But every time I heard it, something inside me withered a little more. The name change felt like a small betrayal every time someone said it. Ada rolled off American tongues easily, fit neatly on standardized test forms without requiring extra boxes, and never required explanation or correction. Teachers smiled when they said it, relieved not to struggle with syllables that felt foreign in their mouths. Classmates nodded approvingly, as if I had finally learned to play by the rules they had never had to think about. But every time I heard it, a piece of my soul withered a little more. It was like hearing a beautiful song played in the wrong key, technically correct but fundamentally wrong. Ada wasn't me. It was a shadow of me, a simplified version that was easier for others to digest but left me feeling empty and disconnected from myself. My parents noticed immediately. "Adiz, why is your teacher calling you Ada in her emails?" my mother asked one evening as we prepared dinner together. She was chopping onions for our evening meal, and I was helping her prepare the vegetables for soup. The familiar rhythm of cooking together had always been our time to talk, our time to connect after long days apart. "It's just easier, Mama," I replied, not meeting her eyes as I chopped tomatoes with more force than necessary. "You know how it is." But she didn't know how it was, and that was part of the problem. My parents had never shortened their names, never felt pressured to make themselves more palatable to American sensibilities. Dr. Emmanuel Okafor commanded respect in every hospital corridor he walked, his name pronounced correctly by nurses and colleagues who had learned to say it properly because they had to. Dr. Grace Okafor had patients who specifically requested her because of her expertise, and they learned to pronounce her name because they needed her skills. They had never felt the need to make themselves smaller to fit into American spaces because they had built their professional reputations on competence and excellence. By the time people encountered them, they were already established as authorities in their fields. But I was just a teenager trying to navigate the social complexities of high school, where belonging mattered more than achievement and acceptance often came at the cost of authenticity. "Adiz is a beautiful name," my mother continued, using the Igbo pronunciation that made it sound like music. "It is your grandmother's gift to you. Why would you hide such a gift?" I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't hiding it by choice. I didn't know how to tell her about the laughter, about the way my classmates had made my name sound like a joke, about the way Mrs. Henderson had dismissed my request for basic respect. I didn't know how to describe the feeling of being constantly asked to explain myself, to justify my existence in spaces where others belonged without question. The discrimination didn't stop with my name. Once my classmates had established that I was other, different, foreign, it seemed to give them permission to make other comments. In AP Government, when we discussed immigration policy, Tyler Brooks turned to me and said, "You probably have some opinions on this, right? You know, being an immigrant and all." As if my academic analysis was somehow less valid because of where I was born, as if my perspective was predetermined by my background rather than informed by research and critical thinking. The way he said, "immigrant," made it sound like an accusation, like something I should be ashamed of. Never mind that I was an honor student with a higher GPA than most of my classmates. Never mind that I could discuss policy implications with more nuance than most adults. My opinion was reduced to my identity, my intelligence dismissed because of my origin story. In calculus, when I scored the highest grade on a particularly difficult test, a test that had left half the class failing and the other half barely passing, Madison Chin, who I had considered a friend, muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Well, her parents are probably making her study 20 hours a day. You know how those families are." As if my success was not my own, but merely the product of some stereotypical cultural expectation. As if Asian and African families were interchangeable in their supposed obsession with academic achievement. The comment stung because Madison and I had studied together. She knew how much I genuinely loved learning, how I stayed up late reading not because my parents forced me to, but because I was genuinely curious about the world. She had seen me choose challenging books for pleasure reading, had watched me dive deep into research projects that went far beyond the minimum requirements. But in that moment, she reduced all of my passion and effort to a cultural stereotype that dismissed my individual agency. These microaggressions accumulated like tiny cuts, each one seemingly small but collectively creating a wound that never quite healed. In English class, when I offered an interpretation of a poem that drew on African literary traditions I had learned from my father, I could see eyes rolling, as if my perspective was somehow less valid because it came from outside the Western canon. In history class, when we studied colonialism and I mentioned my grandfather's stories about British rule in Nigeria, the teacher quickly moved on, as if first-hand historical knowledge was somehow inappropriate for academic discussion. The worst part wasn't the overt racism. Those moments were clear and definable, easier to name and address. It was the subtle erosion of my confidence, the way I started second-guessing myself in every interaction. When I raised my hand in class, I wondered if my answer would be dismissed because of my background. When I spoke passionately about literature or history, I could feel the weight of assumption that my enthusiasm was somehow performative or strange. I began to shrink myself in ways I didn't even realize at first. I stopped wearing the colorful traditional jewelry my grandmother had sent from Nigeria, beautiful gold pieces that told stories of Igbo craftsmanship and cultural pride. Instead, I chose simple silver pieces from Claire's that looked like everyone else's accessories. I avoided bringing my mother's delicious jollof rice for lunch, despite the fact that it was my favorite food and always made me feel connected to home. Instead, I opted for turkey sandwiches and apple slices that wouldn't draw attention or comments about weird food smells. I even found myself moderating my vocabulary, dumbing down my responses so I wouldn't seem like I was trying too hard or showing off. In a country that supposedly valued intelligence and achievement, I was learning to hide both to avoid standing out in ways that made others uncomfortable. The social dynamics were exhausting. I became hyper-aware of every interaction, constantly calculating whether my words or actions would reinforce stereotypes or challenge them. If I was quiet, I worried I was being seen as submissive or weak. If I was assertive, I worried I was being seen as aggressive or uppity. If I excelled academically, I was dismissed as a product of cultural pressure. If I struggled with anything, it was attributed to being foreign or different. There was no winning, no way to be just a regular teenager figuring out life like everyone else. I was always representing something larger than myself, always being watched and judged not as an individual but as a symbol of whatever assumptions people had about African immigrants. The breaking point came during homecoming week in October. Our school had a tradition where seniors could decorate their lockers with themes representing their heritage or interests. I had spent weeks planning a beautiful display celebrating Nigerian culture. Rich purple and green fabrics that echoed the colors of our flag, family photos showing traditional weddings and celebrations, information about Igbo traditions and proverbs, and a gorgeous poster explaining the meaning behind common Nigerian names. I had researched everything carefully, wanting to create something educational and beautiful that would help my classmates understand the richness of my cultural background. I imagined them stopping by my locker, asking questions, learning something new about a part of the world they had probably never thought much about. But the night before the display was due, as I sat in my room surrounded by all the materials I had gathered, I chickened out. The thought of standing next to my locker, answering questions, becoming the spokesperson for an entire continent and culture felt overwhelming. What if they laughed? What if they made jokes? What if they reduced my beautiful, complex heritage to more stereotypes and assumptions? Instead, I threw together a generic future doctor theme with stethoscopes and medical school pamphlets. Safe, acceptable, forgettable. It looked like a dozen other lockers in the hallway, indistinguishable from the displays of other college-bound students. But it wasn't me. It was what I thought I should be, what would cause the least disruption, what would allow me to blend in rather than stand out. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling like I had betrayed not just myself, but every ancestor who had fought for me to be here in this moment with this opportunity. I had been given the chance to share something beautiful, and I had chosen invisibility instead. Lying in my bed, surrounded by the darkness of my suburban bedroom, I felt more alone than I had since those first confusing months after we moved to America. At least then, I had known who I was and where I came from. Now, I wasn't sure of anything except that I was tired of being tired of constantly adjusting myself to fit into spaces that seemed determined to remain too small for all of who I was. The turning point came on a cold November morning when my grandmother passed away. The call came at 4:47 a.m. Denver time, piercing through the quiet suburban morning like a siren. I was pulled from deep sleep by the sound of my mother's voice speaking rapid Igbo into the phone, her tone growing more distressed with each word. Even before I was fully awake, I knew something terrible had happened. There's a particular quality to grief that transcends language barriers, a rawness in the voice that signals loss before the mind can process the details. Enene, as we called her, had been my strongest connection to home. She was the one who taught me Igbo proverbs during our weekly video calls, who told me stories about our family's history that stretched back generations, who reminded me that my name was not just a collection of syllables but a declaration of my worth and heritage. While my parents focused on building our life in America, Enene had been the keeper of our past, the guardian of traditions that connected us to something larger than ourselves. She was the one who had named me. In Igbo tradition, naming is a sacred act, a prophecy spoken over a child's life. When I was born, she had held me in her arms and whispered, "Adiz, daughter of the king," seeing in my infant face something that spoke of strength and leadership. She had told my parents that I would be the one to carry our family's story into new places, to build bridges between worlds. When my mother called me out of chemistry class to tell me the news, I broke down completely in the hallway outside the principal's office. But it wasn't just grief I was feeling, it was regret. Deep, consuming regret that threatened to swallow me whole. Regret that I had spent the last 2 months hiding the very identity that Enene had been so proud of. Regret that I had chosen acceptance over authenticity. regret that I had become a stranger to myself, abandoning the path she had blessed me to walk. The worst part was knowing that she had died without seeing me reclaim my name, without knowing that I had let fear win over pride. In our last video call just 2 weeks earlier, she had asked why my teachers were calling me Ada in the emails my mother had mentioned. I had brushed off her question, telling her it was nothing important, just easier for Americans to pronounce. But I could see the disappointment in her eyes, the way she had nodded sadly and changed the subject. Now she was gone, and I would never be able to show her that I had learned to wear my name with pride again. The funeral was that weekend, and our entire extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles who had flown in from across the country and some from Nigeria, gathered at our house. For the first time in months, I was surrounded by people who pronounced my name correctly without thinking twice, who shared my stories, who understood my struggles without explanation. The house filled with the sound of Igbo being spoken freely, with the smell of traditional foods being prepared with love and care, with the warmth of people who saw me not as an oddity to be explained but as a beloved family member to be embraced. It was like stepping into a warm bath after being cold for months, a reminder of what belonging actually felt like. My cousin Amara, who was a sophomore at Harvard, pulled me aside during the repast. She was everything I aspired to be: brilliant, confident, successful, but also unapologetically Nigerian. She wore her hair in beautiful natural styles, spoke Igbo fluently, and had somehow managed to excel academically while never hiding who she was. "You know," she said as we sat together on the back porch watching relatives share stories and laughter despite their grief, "and he used to brag about you all the time. She said you were going to be the one to show America what our family was capable of. She was so proud of your name, of the way you carried yourself." The words hit me like a physical blow. I almost broke down again right there on the porch. "But I haven't been carrying myself with pride," I confessed, my voice barely audible. "I've been hiding. I've been ashamed." Amara nodded knowingly, her expression serious but kind. "I did the same thing my freshman year at Harvard. Started going by Amy because I thought it would make things easier. You know what I learned? Making yourself smaller never makes you more successful. It just makes you disappear." She told me about her own journey, about the professors who had initially dismissed her perspectives, about the classmates who had made assumptions about her intelligence and background. But she had also told me about the moment she decided to stop shrinking, to start taking up the space she deserved rather than the space others were comfortable giving her. "The thing about code switching," she said, "is that it's supposed to be a tool, not a prison. You should be able to move between worlds, not lose yourself trying to fit into someone else's version of who you should be." That night, I sat in my room surrounded by photos of NNE and made a decision that would change the trajectory of my senior year. I was going to reclaim my name, my story, and my pride, not in a quiet, apologetic way but boldly and unapologetically. I was going to honor the woman who had seen something special in me before I could even speak, who had blessed me with a name that carried the strength of generations. I started with research. I spent hours diving into the history of my name, learning things that NNE had tried to teach me but that I had been too young or too distracted to fully understand. I discovered that Adiz wasn't just a name, it was a title of respect, traditionally given to the first daughter of someone important. It meant daughter of the king or princess, and it carried with it expectations of leadership, wisdom, and strength. I learned about the kingdom of Nri, one of the oldest kingdoms in Nigeria, where women could hold positions of power and influence. I read about Queen Zinga of Angola, who had fought against Portuguese colonizers with strategic brilliance and unwavering courage. I discovered stories of Igbo women who had led markets, settled disputes, and preserved cultural traditions through centuries of change and challenge. My name connected me to all of this history, all of this strength. It wasn't just what my parents had decided to call me, it was a legacy, a responsibility, a reminder of what I was capable of achieving. More importantly, I learned that I wasn't alone. There were thousands of students across America with names that teachers mispronounced, names that carried deep cultural significance, names that connected them to rich traditions and proud histories. There were online communities of young people sharing their experiences, offering support and strategies for maintaining cultural identity while navigating American institutions. I read about Uzoamako Aduba, the actress who had refused to shorten her name despite agents and casting directors telling her it would hurt her career. I learned about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the writer who had become internationally famous while keeping her full, beautiful, complicated, Nigerian name. I discovered that success didn't require erasure, it required courage. Sitting there in my room, looking at pictures of my grandmother and reading about the women who had paved the way before me, I made a decision that felt like coming home to myself. I was going to do something about the culture of name-shaming and cultural dismissal I had experienced. I was going to use my voice not just to reclaim my own identity, but to create space for others to do the same. I decided to do something that would honor Anani's memory and potentially change the culture at my school forever. I started small. The next Monday, when Mrs. Henderson called attendance and said Ada, I gently but firmly corrected her. Actually, Mrs. Henderson, I'd prefer if you called me by my full name, Adiz. She looked surprised, her pen hovering over the attendance sheet as if she wasn't sure how to process this request. But I thought you preferred the shorter version? I've changed my mind, I said clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the classroom. There was something different in my tone now, not apologetic or uncertain, but calm and resolute. My name is Adiz, and it's important to me that it's pronounced correctly. Adiz. I repeated it slowly, giving her time to hear each syllable, to understand that this wasn't a request but a statement of fact. I watched her face as she processed my words, seeing the moment when she realized this was not a negotiation. Of course, she said finally, making a note on her paper. Adiz. It wasn't perfect, the pronunciation was still a little uncertain, but it was my name and that made all the difference. For the next week, I patiently corrected every teacher, every classmate, every administrator who mispronounced my name or tried to call me Ada. Some were receptive and apologetic, genuinely embarrassed that they had been saying it wrong and eager to learn the correct pronunciation. Others were frustrated, as if my insistence on dignity was somehow inconvenient for them, as if my request for basic respect was an unreasonable burden. But I didn't stop there. Each correction became a teaching moment, an opportunity to share something about myself and my culture. When Mr. Peterson in calculus asked why the pronunciation mattered so much, I explained that names carry meaning and history, that mine connected me to generations of strong women and rich cultural traditions. When Sarah in government class asked if I was being too sensitive about the whole thing, I told her to imagine if people consistently mispronounced her name and then asked her to change it to make their lives easier. Slowly, I watched understanding dawn on some faces. They began to see that this wasn't about being difficult or attention-seeking. It was about basic human dignity and respect. But I didn't stop there. I approached our school's diversity club and proposed a project, Names Matter Week. The idea was simple but powerful. We would create presentations about the meaning and significance of names from different cultures, helping educate our school community about the stories behind the names they encountered every day. Think about it, I said to the group of 12 students who attended the meeting. How many times have you heard someone's name mispronounced and just accepted it? How many times have you seen someone asked to choose an easier name, or go by a nickname that strips away their cultural identity? We have the power to change that culture. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Students from all backgrounds wanted to participate. Maria Elena Rodriguez wanted to share the tradition behind her double name and explain why both parts were important to her family's history. Raj Patel wanted to explain the spiritual significance of his name and how it connected him to Hindu traditions. Even some white students wanted to research and share the origins of their family names, discovering stories of immigration and cultural preservation they had never known. We spent 2 weeks preparing presentations, researching naming traditions from around the world, and creating beautiful displays that celebrated the diversity of our school community. I worked with the art department to create large posters showing names written in their original scripts, Arabic, Chinese, Hindi, Amharic, and dozens of others. We interviewed students about their name stories and created a video montage that would play during lunch periods. But the most powerful moment came when I stood up in front of the entire school during the Assembly for Names Matter Week. I had volunteered to be the keynote speaker, to share my story and challenge my classmates to think differently about the power of names and identity. Standing at the podium, looking out at 800 faces, I felt a moment of panic. These were the same students who had laughed at my name just months before. These were the teachers who had asked me to choose something easier. These were the people whose approval I had once desperately sought, whose comfort I had prioritized over my own dignity. But then I thought about Anani, about the strength she had seen in me before I could even speak. I thought about all the students sitting in that auditorium who had probably felt the same shame I had felt, who had probably made themselves smaller to fit into spaces that should have expanded to include them. My name is Adiz Okafor, I began, my voice clear and confident, each syllable pronounced with deliberate care. 2 months ago, some of you laughed when our teacher mispronounced it. Some of you suggested I get an easier name, an American name. Today, I want to tell you what my name really means and why your laughter hurt more than you probably realized. The auditorium was completely silent. I could see Mrs. Henderson in the third row, looking uncomfortable but attentive. I could see Jake Martinez avoiding eye contact, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something that looked like shame. But I could also see other students with names like mine, students who had been hiding parts of themselves, leaning forward with interest and hope. Adiz means daughter of the king in Igbo, one of the major languages of Nigeria, I continued. It's not just a name, it's a blessing, a prophecy, a reminder that I come from royalty. Not European royalty that you read about in history books, but African royalty that built kingdoms and traded across continents centuries before America was even founded. I went on to explain the tradition behind Igbo names, how they often commemorate important events or express parents' hopes for their children. I talked about my grandmother who had chosen my name after holding me and seeing something special in my future. I shared stories of other successful people who had kept their difficult names and found success not in spite of their identity but because of it. When you laugh at someone's name, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, you're not just laughing at a collection of syllables. You're laughing at their history, their family, their identity. You're telling them that who they are is not worthy of respect. I talked about the psychological impact of name discrimination, how it affected academic performance and self-esteem. I shared research showing that people with ethnic-sounding names face discrimination in hiring and college admissions. I challenged my classmates to think about the privilege of having a name that was never questioned, never mocked, never seen as an obstacle to overcome. But this isn't just about names, I said, approaching the end of my speech. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels welcome to bring their full selves to school, to work, to community spaces. It's about recognizing that diversity isn't just about numbers in a yearbook photo. It's about creating environments where different perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences are valued, not just tolerated. I ended with a challenge. I'm asking each of you to learn something new about someone different from yourself this week. Ask about their name, their family traditions, their cultural background. Don't make assumptions. Don't ask them to make themselves smaller to fit your comfort zone. Make your own world bigger instead. The response was immediate and profound. Students came up to me for weeks afterward, apologizing for their behavior, asking questions about Nigerian culture, sharing their own stories of feeling judged or misunderstood. Teachers began making more effort to learn correct pronunciations and even started asking students about the meanings behind their names during introductions. The administration was so impressed with the impact of Names Matter Week that they implemented a policy requiring faculty to ask students how they preferred their names to be pronounced and to make note of correct pronunciations in their gradebooks. They also added cultural competency training to their professional development requirements. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Jake Martinez, the boy who had suggested calling me African Princess in such a mocking tone. He approached me after school one day, looking genuinely remorseful. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. Adiz, he said, pronouncing it carefully and slowly, clearly having practiced. I owe you an apology. I was ignorant and cruel and I'm sorry. Thank you, I said simply, surprised by how much his apology meant to me. That means a lot. Can I ask you something? He continued, shifting nervously from foot to foot. You said your name means daughter of the king. Does that make you feel pressure to be perfect all the time? It was such an insightful question that I was momentarily surprised. It showed he had really listened to my presentation, had thought deeply about what I had shared. Sometimes, I admitted honestly. But it also reminds me that I have the strength to overcome challenges. That I come from people who were leaders and survivors. It's not about being perfect. It's about living up to my potential. I never thought about names having that kind of power, he said. I grew up thinking American meant normal and everything else was weird. I know that's messed up now. His honesty was refreshing, and it reminded me that most prejudice comes from ignorance rather than malice. That's the thing about growing up, I said. We get to choose which ideas we keep and which ones we outgrow. Over the following months, Jake became one of my unexpected allies. He started calling out other students when they made ignorant comments about cultural differences. He even did his senior project on the history of Mexican-American identity, exploring his own family's immigration story with a depth and respect I never would have expected from the boy who had once mocked my heritage. As I write this now, months later and weeks away from graduating as valedictorian of Westfield High School, I think about how much has changed since that September morning when laughter filled our classroom. I think about the girl who walked into AP Literature afraid of taking up too much space, and I marvel at how different she is from the young woman who will soon walk across the graduation stage. I learned that assimilation and acceptance are not the same thing. True acceptance doesn't require you to erase yourself or make yourself smaller. It requires others to expand their understanding and embrace the beautiful complexity of human identity. The goal isn't to fit into existing spaces. It's to create new spaces big enough for everyone to belong authentically. I learned that my name is not just what people call me, it's a declaration of who I am and where I come from. When I shortened it to Ada, I wasn't just making things easier for others, I was participating in my own erasure. I was sending the message that my full identity was somehow too much, too difficult, too foreign for American spaces. But the truth is, America is strengthened by the richness of its diversity, not weakened by it. Most importantly, I learned that education is a two-way street. While I was working so hard to fit into American culture, I forgot that I had just as much right to share my culture with America. My classmates' ignorance wasn't malicious, it was just ignorance. And ignorance can be cured with patience, education, and courage. But it requires people like me to be willing to speak up, to share our stories, to refuse to shrink ourselves for the comfort of others. The ripple effects of Names Matter Week continued throughout the year. Other schools in our district heard about it and implemented similar programs. The local newspaper wrote an article about it that was picked up by national outlets. Most importantly, I received messages from students around the country who had been inspired to reclaim their own names and cultural identities. There was Xiomara in Phoenix who stopped going by Zoe and educated her teachers about the beauty of her Mexican heritage. There was Siobhan in Boston who refused to accept Shubon as an acceptable pronunciation and taught her classmates about Irish Gaelic traditions. There was Rajdeep in Seattle who stopped introducing himself as Raj and started sharing the spiritual significance of his full name. Each message reminded me that my grandmother's prophecy was coming true in ways she never could have imagined. I was indeed carrying our family story into new places, building bridges between worlds. But I was also helping other young people find the courage to build their own bridges, to refuse the false choice between success and authenticity. Today, when I walk across the stage to receive my diploma, when they call my name, my full, beautiful, complicated name, it will ring out clearly, Adise Grace Okafor. It will carry with it the hopes of my parents who sacrificed everything for this moment. It will honor the memory of my grandmother who told me that my name was my crown. And it will represent every student who has ever felt pressured to make themselves smaller to fit into spaces that seem too narrow for their full identity. The journey taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of fear. When I first corrected Mrs. Henderson when I proposed Names Matter Week, when I stood up in front of the entire school, I was terrified. But I was more afraid of losing myself completely than I was of being rejected for who I truly was. I've learned that our names are our first poems, our initial introductions to the world, our earliest declarations of identity. They carry our parents' hopes, our cultural traditions, our family histories. When we allow others to mispronounce them, dismiss them, or replace them with easier alternatives, we're not just compromising on syllables, we're compromising on our souls. But I've also learned that change is possible. Hearts can be opened, minds can be expanded, cultures can evolve. It requires patience and persistence, education and empathy. It requires young people like me to be willing to stand up and speak out, to share our stories even when our voices shake, to insist on dignity even when it's uncomfortable for others. They laughed at my name because they didn't understand its power. But now they do. And that has made all the difference, not just for me but for every student who will walk through those hallways after me, carrying names that tell stories of strength and survival, courage and hope. In the end, I didn't need to change my name to succeed in America. America needed to expand its definition of what an American name could sound like. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act is simply insisting on being called by your own name, correctly, respectfully, and with pride. My name is Adise. I am the daughter of kings and queens, doctors and teachers, survivors and dreamers. I am Nigerian and American, African and global citizen. I am exactly who I was meant to be, and my name will never again be a source of shame. It is my crown and I wear it proudly. And now, thanks to the courage I found in my grandmother's love and my own determination to honor her memory, I've helped create a world where other young people can wear their crowns proudly too. The laughter has been replaced by understanding. The shame has been transformed into pride. And the girl who once thought she had to choose between belonging and authenticity has learned that the most beautiful spaces are the ones we create together. Spaces big enough for all of our names, all of our stories, all of our dreams. Looking back, I realized that my journey was never really about getting people to pronounce my name correctly. It was about learning to value myself enough to demand the respect I deserved. It was about understanding that my difference wasn't a deficit to be hidden, but a gift to be shared. It was about discovering that strength doesn't come from fitting in, but from standing out with purpose and pride. The girl who started this year going by Ada taught me something important. We can lose ourselves gradually, one small compromise at a time, until we wake up one day and don't recognize who we've become. But the woman I am today has learned an even more important lesson. We can also find ourselves again, one brave moment at a time, until we wake up one day and remember exactly who we were always meant to be. My name is Adiz, and it will always be Adiz. It is the sound of my grandmother's love, the echo of my ancestors' strength, and the promise of my own unlimited potential. It is the first gift I was ever given and the last thing I will ever surrender. And that, I have learned, makes all the difference in the world.